Hello and welcome to my video on the psychodynamic approach. Like many of my videos, this is directed towards the AQA A-level specification, but should be applicable to other specs and general interests. So we'll start where I usually do, which is looking at that specification. So we're down here on the fourth bullet point, so the psychodynamic approach. So hopefully you'll have a bit of an understanding of some of the other approaches so we can compare them. And what you'll need to know from this video lesson is the role of the unconscious, the structures that are involved in personality, including the id, the ego and the superego, defense mechanisms, including repression, denial and displacement, and the psychosexual stages. So I'll be focusing mainly on these key words. First thing to say really is the psychodynamic approach is a very famous approach within psychology, sometimes called the psychoanalytic approach. The therapy involved in it is psychoanalysis, sometimes often called the Freudian approach, and that is because of this geezer here, Sigmund Freud. So he is probably the most famous psychologist. If you ask anyone to name a psychologist, even if they've not studied psychology, they'll probably be able to come up with Sigmund Freud. And the reason for that is he is one of the kind of the founding fathers within psychology. He was one of the first people to kind of bring it all together and come up with some theories. And again, if you've already looked at origins of psychology, I've got another video on that if you're interested. It's part of the spec. Then you'll be aware of that as well. So you may well have looked at, hopefully you have looked at the other videos in terms of the behavioural approach, social learning, cognitive, biological. Well, actually the psychodynamic approach probably came before those ones, and so that's why it's seen as one of the most important, because it's the one that kind of really started the rest of them off. However, we'll discuss later on that maybe some of the theories aren't quite used as much as they were, and you might see why that is. But its importance in starting the debate is undeniable. So as already mentioned in the specification, some of the bits that we look at are the areas of the mind. They are the conscious, the pre-conscious and the unconscious. We'll go into a bit more detail about that in a second. Aspects of personality, including the id, the ego and the superego. So personality, id, ego and superego, those are key terms within the psychodynamic approach. You're going to need to get those down, and again I'll go over those in a bit more detail in a moment. And then defense mechanisms, repression, denial and displacement. And we'll look at psychosexual stages of development as well. So those are all kind of, they do feed into that specification that we looked at a moment ago. Right. To start then, we'll look at the mind. So Sigmund Freud had this idea that the mind had some different levels, and those levels he called the conscious, the pre-conscious and the unconscious. So the conscious part of the mind, that is us now. You must have heard of the term consciousness. So that's us, what we're aware of, the world that we're in now. Before you get to that stage, he said we went through that there are pre-conscious stages, and so that's maybe just before you speak. You might think about what you're going to say. You might have something called the tip of the tongue phenomenon, where you know a word, you know it, but it's not quite there. This is what Freud would have described as being the pre-conscious. So you're not quite aware of it, but maybe it's just below the surface. So it's almost that interplay between the conscious, what you are aware of, what you're saying, what you're hearing, and your kind of inner thoughts, deeper thoughts. That deeper part he called the unconscious, and the unconscious is a very important part of the mind, according to Freud. According to Freud, all of our behaviours, the way we act, the way we think, comes from our unconscious. So these are our drivers, our instincts, and many of these developed in childhood, and we'll look at that again a bit later on in this theory. But what Freud said is that the way that we act, the way that we interact with other people, is because of what's in our unconscious. There are different ways for information or these drives and instincts to get into our conscious, and we'll look at that. But what he said is that essentially they are locked away, they are forgotten. There's no way when you're awake and conscious to actually access the unconscious. However, he did say there are ways that you can potentially access the unconscious, and we'll look at that again when it comes to treatments. So dreams, for example, are one way. He said that when you're asleep, your sensor to your unconscious is turned off, and so you can potentially access it. He used free association is almost before the sensor reacts, you're able to access your unconscious if you get people to say the first thing that comes into their head. So that was his idea of the mind. He said there were these three separate levels. The most important of which probably being the unconscious, but actually you can't necessarily access it. There's issues there when it comes to explaining human behaviour in that way, because you then say, okay, well, the reason that a newly married man asked for one ticket before when he got onto a bus when he was with his wife, Freud would say, well, actually that's his unconscious saying he doesn't want to be married because he only asked for one ticket rather than two for his wife as well. Well, how can you dispute that? How can you say, well, no, actually it's wrong, it was just a mistake? So there's unfalsifiability, but we'll look at that when we come to the evaluation. Another part of Freud's theory involves the personality, and he had ideas about what makes up an individual's personality. And there are three key aspects here. First of which is the id. So he called the id the pleasure principle. So the idea is that we have a part of our personality that it's basically our instinctual drives, our drive to be fed, our drive to drink, our drive to have sex. All of our primitive drives, survival drives, in other words, are determined by our id. So there's a part of our personality that wants pleasure from eating, wants pleasure from sex, wants pleasure from having the good things in life, basically, and that's known as our id. The second part he called our ego, and that's known as the reality principle. And our ego can almost be thought of our consciousness. What we would consider ourselves would probably be our ego. So it tries to control the id a little bit, and tries to say, well, you can't always just eat the cake or you're going to get fat. You can't always just have sex because there are rules around those things. And so the role of the ego is to reduce conflict and to almost live in the real world. The final part was known as our superego, and this is our morality principle. It's the idea between what's right and what's wrong, and again that kind of controls the id. And so that the picture that I've got up there actually almost illustrates what we're talking about here. So the id can be thought of as the devil on your shoulder, always wanting the bad thing, wanting satisfaction right here, right now. The superego is the angel on your shoulder, saying, no, this is right, you can't do that in society, this is what's wrong and right. And you're almost stuck in the middle as the ego, in kind of the conscious mind. So those are three important ideas: the id, the ego, and the superego. And you can kind of remember it in terms of the devil on your shoulder, the angel on your shoulder, and kind of the ego there stuck in the middle. He teamed the personality up with the idea of the mind and said that the different areas of the personality lie in different areas of the mind. And he used what he called the iceberg analogy. So what you've got at the top here is obviously the area that's visible. So in terms of the mind, it's what we're conscious of, so that's the conscious. And actually, so we've got the ego, so that's the part of you that's accessible. It's the part of you that you would be aware of, that you would probably identify as yourself or personality. The superego also comes into here because that has to do with kind of, as we say, morality, what's right and wrong, etc. He said that the id, the pleasure principle, that's unconscious. Okay, and remember, we can't access the unconscious, but it's driving us. So he said every day we're driven to perform particular acts and to think in particular ways because of these pleasure principles, but you can't necessarily access the information that's down there. So it's actually quite a neat idea if you think about it. And remember, Freud was fairly early in terms of psychologist, and this was actually quite a good way of, at that time, of understanding why people acted in a particular way, why they thought the way they did, but we'll go on to looking at some sort of evaluation as well. That's just another thing to kind of bear in mind. Another part of Freud's theory involves what he called defense mechanisms, and he said that your defense mechanisms lie in your unconscious. Again, so that would be the kind of the bit below the water in the iceberg analogy. And what he says that the defense mechanisms do, they kind of protect you, they protect your ego, maybe against things that would be unpleasant otherwise. And there were many defense mechanisms. We'll look at 3 in particular here. So the first defense mechanism was repression. Okay, so if you were to have an unpleasant thought, and that would affect your ego, it would affect your conscious. The idea is of repression, you would force that down. So you would force it into the unconscious. So you're not thinking about it anymore, you're not aware of it, and it's, as far as you're aware, it's not affecting you, although in the unconscious it would be, but you wouldn't be thinking about it, and that's the main thing. So this would be something, maybe you thought an unpleasant thought about someone you liked, maybe a friend or family member, you wished them ill, wished them, I don't know, that they hurt themselves or something like that. You'd know that that was an unpleasant thought, and so you'd push that down into your unconscious. So you're not thinking it anymore, and you're happier. However, it's obviously still remember that it's resting there in your unconscious and could potentially affect your later behaviour and later thinking. Denial is the next defense mechanism, and that's literally just refusing to acknowledge something. So there might be something that is quite obvious, quite fat. You might, I don't know, you might have always not done very well in driving tests, and you think of yourself as a really, really, really good driver, and you're better than all your friends, and you think you'd win in any races, or you think you're a safer driver than any of your other mates. But actually, the evidence goes against that. So you've had more crashes, you haven't passed your driving test, you don't win when you go karting. So a defense mechanism to protect yourself, to protect your idea that you're a good driver, is just denial. You refuse to accept, you refuse to acknowledge that thing has happened, and so you just literally deny it. And that's a defense mechanism. It's protecting your ego. And finally, there's displacement, and this is where you have a thought that you feel is unwanted, unnatural, and so rather than accepting that thought is part of you, you place that onto something or someone else. Okay, so this would be, maybe you are quite an aggressive person, and it wouldn't be acceptable to go around punching people in the street, so you take up boxing, and so you've still got those angry feelings, but you're putting it onto something maybe more constructive, not necessarily all constructive. So this could be, maybe you have thoughts that you worry about, maybe you're homosexual and you see that as a bad thing, maybe, and you're worried about getting judged, and so rather than accepting that's maybe part of yourself, you call other people gay, and I'm sure people can relate to that. So these are the defense mechanisms. As I said, there are others. The idea, as I hope you've picked up, is to protect your conscious thoughts, protect your ego, and quite often the unconscious and the superego are involved in that as well. One of the last theories we'll look at in terms of psychodynamic approach or Freudian approach is the psychosexual stages of development. Now, this one is, what can we say, it's a little strange, and I know you're going to snigger, but it was one of Freud's theories. Lots of theories as to why he came up with theories like this himself. I'll let you judge that, and we will discuss further in class, but it's one you do need to know. It is potentially amusing, but we'll go through it as best we can. Anyway, so Freud believed that development and childhood had a big role to play on who we end up being as an adult. And actually, that's an idea in psychology. Freud was one of the first to think of that, and that's an idea we still believe in, and that still happens now. So we still think that childhood is really, really important in terms of development. Freud placed a large emphasis on the role of sex in general life and as well in development, and so that's how he ended up coming up with the psychosexual stages of development. So he said that as we grow up, we develop and we change, and as I say, most people agree on that now. He put that in terms of sexual development. So he said that even from a very young age, we're aware of sex, we're aware of the big role it plays. Again, you can potentially link that back to the id, being a pleasure principle, desiring pleasurable experiences, which sex is, and so that's where kind of this comes from. So he says that there are different parts of sex, and those come at different ages. So if we look here, he said that the first psychosexual stage of development is the oral stage. Yeah, laugh away. So oral sex, etc. But as a child, obviously, we're not thinking of it in that terms, because that would just be weird and a bit creepy. So what the psychosexual stage of development are saying is that actually it's the oral sensation that the child is fixated on. And actually, if you think about it, that is true. So a child of between 0 and 1 years old, a lot is focused around the mouth. So and the main reason for that is obviously feeding. If the child doesn't feed, doesn't eat, it's going to die. So it's a really, really important instinctual drive. And so and you can see how Freud kind of came to this. So he said that actually things in and around the mouth, it'd obviously be the mother's nipple or a teat on a bottle in more modern times. That's the focus of the child between 0 and 1 years old. And obviously then as we develop older, later, it becomes important as well. So what another of Freud's ideas is that we all go through all of these stages. And if you healthily pass through this stage, you'll end up as a healthy, grown-up individual. However, if something happens at that stage and you don't pass through it normally, then things happen later in life, and that can cause problems. And he called this a fixation. That's a good term to have. So if you're stuck at a particular stage of development, you're fixated at that stage. So what he says is, if you don't go through good oral psychosexual development, you will end up being fixated at the oral stage. And if you're fixated at the oral stage, what happens is you're more likely to take up smoking, again focused around the mouth. You would be more it would be negative things, so bad mouthing people, use of foul language, that's fixation at the oral stage. Biting nails, always having something in and around the mouth, that is known as a fixation at the oral stage, and says that you might not have developed through psychosexual development in a positive way. Once we go through that stage, and once we developed orally in a psychosexual stage, we then go to the anal stage. And again, funny term, yeah, I get it. And this is between 1 year and 3 years old. But again, if you think about it, it wasn't that radical, because actually at that age, it's toilet training, isn't it? Children are quite fixated with their toileting facilities. And so it does make sense that the child is fixated with the anus. So this is kind of getting rid of feces, training from using a nappy into proper toilet training. And again, Freud said if you don't go through that properly, you get fixated. And there are two types of anal stage fixation. There's known as anal retentive. So that is someone that is maybe doesn't like. It's even hard to say. Doesn't like pooing. It gets a bit weird about maybe talking about. Maybe I'm a bit anal retentive. Gets weird about talking about it, and doesn't like going to talk. So they would hold on to their feces. And so someone like that, think of someone quite uptight. And so if you're like that, if you're fixated at that stage, you'd be a bit of a perfectionist. He said that would develop into OCD if you're. So you don't like mess. You don't like, again, feces is quite messy, so you don't like that sort of stuff. You could go the other way though. You could absolutely love it. You could love a bit of poo here and there, and so you could be fixated at the anal stage, but the other extreme. So this would be someone really, really messy. Freud would say would probably be anally expulsive. So you just love it a bit too much. The next stage of development is the phallic stage. So that's between 3 and 5 years. For those that don't know, phallus is another word for your penis, your willy. And again, it makes sense that the child kind of naturally progresses towards that. And this is the age, if you think about child development, this is the age that children start realizing that there are differences between a boy and a girl. And obviously genitalia is one of the main things, sexual organs, one of the main things that is different. And so again, he wasn't a million miles off, and it does make sense. He said that boys develop through one process called the Oedipus complex, and girls develop through another called the Electra complex. And again, everyone goes through that. Healthy development through that is fine. However, you can get fixated at that stage, and if you don't successfully go through the Oedipus complex for boys, the Electra complex for girls, then you could potentially become quite vain and self-obsessed. He said this is where homosexuality comes from, is not adequately developing through the Oedipus and Electra complex. I'll talk a little bit more in a second about the Oedipus and Electra complex, because we'll look at a case study and we'll look at what that actually is, but you just need to know those terms for now. After that, if you develop successfully through that, you then get to the latency stage. And this is between about 5 years old and puberty. And actually nothing necessarily new happens here, but what happens is you consolidate everything that's gone before. It's obviously a big area of change and development, and what Freud would say is that you repress conflicts that have gone before. So there might have been this Oedipus and Electra complex, there's a conflict there, anal, oral, sexual development. Those complexes are kind of repressed, and then you're able to focus on more adult goals, and that's what's happening between the age of 5 and puberty. And then the final stage of psychosexual development is the genital stage, and this happens between puberty and adulthood, and this is where, as the ages suggest, you turn into an adult. So this is where obviously all these drives, we talk about children here and going to the toilet and feeding and discovering the difference between genders. This is where Freud said you did develop sexual desires, and so healthy development through the genital stage. Boys would go on to want heterosexual relationships with a female. Females would want a heterosexual relationship with a male, and that's kind of the goal. You would end up in a development. And so again, it's quite drive orientated, isn't it? Finding a mate to have a family with, to pass on your genes. That's essentially what Freud was talking about. If you don't pass through these stages well, then you end up having poor relationships. So you'd maybe not develop long-term relationships. You might develop relationships that aren't healthy. Abuse, etc., might happen here. You might develop sexual difficulties. Remember, this is all according to Freud. I'm not saying this, so don't judge me. But yeah, this is what Freud would say. So those are the sexual stages. As I say, we'll talk a little bit more about the Oedipus and Electra complex in a second. You do need to know these stages. So oral, anal, phallic, latency, genital. Ideally, you would know some of the ages as well. Something that might help you do this, there's a saying which is OAPs like grapes. And so if you can remember OAPs like grapes, and there is a picture of some OAPs and some grapes to try and help you, that then leads to the different phases. O, oral, A, anal, phallic, P, phallic, so OAP, latency, L, and grapes, G. So OAPs like grapes should help you remember oral, anal, phallic, latency, genital. Linked to the idea of psychosexual stages of development is the case study of little Hans. Now, little Hans was a 5-year-old boy, and Hans's father was a fan of Freud's work and Freud's theories. So when Hans's father found out that his son was having strange dreams, he looked to Freud for some ideas and for some theories. And what he found was the theory of the Oedipus complex, and this is thought to develop through the phallic stage of psychosexual development. And the Oedipus complex is one of the more kind of obscure ideas, and it's been quite criticised, but it's one of Freud's ideas. And the Oedipus complex states that as a child, as a little boy develops, they have to go through the psychosexual development, as we were talking about earlier. And what happens is, obviously, little boys, that they develop their first sexual desire, and as their mothers are the key, you can see what's coming here, as their mothers are the primary female figure in their lives, the theory goes that they develop sexual desire towards their mothers. So yeah, a little bit odd, but that's part of the theory. And the idea in the Oedipus complex is that there's a conflict there. Obviously, if the boy is fancying their mother, they've then got their father as a sexual competitor, because they both want access to the mother. It's a bit cringy. So that's the idea of the Oedipus complex, and it comes from kind of Greek mythology, and fear for what the father might do, and they would worry that the father would chop their willy off. So what the child then has to do is divert that desire onto a more acceptable mate, I guess. Father as kind of a role for their own. So the idea is that all males go through this. Sorry, boys, and coming out of it the other side, you end up being healthy. So if you go through this and successfully get over that desire, then that's when you can develop your own heterosexual relationships. And so little Hans was having dreams, and having dreams about horses, and he was scared of these horses. He saw them fall over and die, and it was disturbing him. He was being awoken at night, and so Freud applied the theory of the Oedipus complex onto Hans's dreams, and dream analysis is one of Freud's theories for accessing the unconscious. And so Freud suggested that the reason that Hans was scared of the horses was because he used the horse as a symbol for his father. So horses have black lips, and his father had a moustache, so he said that almost the horse's black lips related to the father's moustache. The father wore glasses, and little Hans had seen horses with blinkers on, and horses have large penises, and Hans would have seen his father's penis as large. Yeah, I'll just let that sit with you for a while. So that's the idea, that there's this identification, there's this picturing and interpreting the horse as the father. And so Freud uses this to support his theory. Now, girls, just when you think you've got away with theory for you as well, that was known as the electric complex. Obviously not directly related to little Hans, but it does fit in with this extra bit, which is all about the phallic stage of psychosexual development. That's where the Oedipus complex is meant to happen for boys, and for girls you get the electric complex, and you develop something known as penis envy. That's right, girls, you're envious that boys have got penises. So little girls would they would blame their mother for not giving them a penis. Yeah, and so they would want a penis of their own, and they would feel that it was their mother's fault because their mother didn't have one. They obviously didn't have one either, and they would desire their father as well, because their father does have a penis, obviously, and they would blame their mother for this. So again, that's every girl is meant to have gone through this, but the idea is that, again, you successfully pass through this development, and rather than disliking the mother for it, you use her as a role model, and you divert those feelings, so it gets repressed into the unconscious, and those feelings are diverted into more appropriate later adult relationships if you successfully go through these theories. So a bit of a case study there that is meant to provide some sort of support for psychosexual development theory, and a little bit more information on the phallic stage of development. Make some interesting reading as well, if you want to read around the subject and look at some other YouTube videos. Okay, last then, we need to evaluate. So this is our AO3, and we need to look for some strengths and weaknesses. So this is the time, if you did disagree with any of those ideas and theories, that's fine, but you need to be able to obviously put it into some sort of constructive evaluation. So there are strengths, and this is often overlooked, but there are lots of strengths to the theory. Freud was actually a pioneer. He was one of the first people to come along and put lots of ideas of personality and development, etc., together, and so that's a strength of the theory. So that's the second point there. So it does explain early development. We now know, and we now understand, and we still believe that what our childhood was like, that dictates and has some sort of say in what our adult life was like. And we still believe that now, and that's what Freud believed, essentially, is psychosexual development. So that's correct. It links to abnormality as well. Freud tried to explain why people might have mental health disorders, and again, we still look at that regardless of what approach you look at. So the basic idea of the theory is correct, even if you don't completely agree with all of the theories within it. There's also application, so that's a second strength. We've used application in some of the other approaches. Psychoanalysis is the theory, the therapy associated with the psychodynamic approach, and that's still used today, and it still does have good success in certain cases, certain disorders. So that's another strength of the theory. There are, though, as you can imagine, a few weaknesses. If we go straight back to that Little Hans study that we were just talking about there are issues around that. Firstly, subjectivity. I said that that Little Hans's father was a big fan of Freud, and he presented with all the information. So it's a subjective view. He almost maybe wanted the reports of his son to fit in with Freud's theory, so it's not an objective view. There are opinions that could have coloured the outcome there. There's also the issue of generalizability. Just because this happened to Little Hans doesn't mean it's going to happen to everyone. Case studies, generally an issue with case studies is generalizability, the fact that you can't actually apply the findings from that one case onto lots of other cases. So there's an issue with the case studies. The big issue, the thing that I find a problem with a lot of the psychodynamic theories is unfalsifiability. And that term means that you can't test it, you can't falsify it, you can't prove it wrong. So lots of the things that the psychodynamic approach says causes behaviour and causes thinking is due to the unconscious, this area of the brain that you can't access. Well, that's really handy, isn't it? If you're trying to explain a theory and you're trying to say, well, why did someone do that? Why did someone act that way? You say, oh, it's because they're unconscious. Can't test that, though. So that's a big problem. It's hard to test the unconscious, hard to test whether these repressed thoughts, because you're not meant to be able to access them, are actually causing the behaviour. Better theories, more scientific theories, you say that this is the cause and you're able to test that and see whether that's correct or not, whereas that's not the case with the unconscious, certainly. And the final issue is the idea of determinism. Almost links back to the unconscious again, but the idea that we're saying, well, all of our behaviour is caused by the unconscious, lots of our behaviour is caused by the unconscious. It kind of takes away the idea of free will, so it's quite deterministic. It says, well, this is why it is, even though that might not actually be the case. There's something called a Freudian slip. So if you accidentally say the wrong thing, you could just have accidentally said the wrong thing. But according to the psychodynamic approach, there's causes behind that. You can't test them, but there are causes behind it. So examples that they've used are maybe a newly married man going to buy bus tickets for him and his wife, and he asked for one ticket. So that might just be an honest mistake. The guy's not used to buying 2 tickets. But according to psychodynamic psychologists, well, that means he doesn't want to be in the marriage because he's forgot his wife. So that's the issue. You can't test it. It takes away free will. There's the determinism element there. Other examples of Freudian slips are saying the wrong thing. So if someone asks what you think of their new outfit, you say, oh yeah, that's very fattening. You meant flattering. All you did is miss out a letter, or mix up some letters, and you actually genuinely did meant to say flattering. Almost messed up myself there, but you get the wrong term. So you could have just honestly made a mistake. However, again, in the psychodynamic approach, there's this sinister undertone of you were meant to say that, so it's determined. There's no free will. The things you do, the way you act, the things you say, there's all this cause, whereas actually that might not be the case. So we need to be quite objective when testing these theories. Okay, so that's that for the psychodynamic approach. Thank you as ever for listening. Please do subscribe, and I will be updating my channel with some more videos, hopefully of other topics as well. But goodbye for now.